Yo, what's up everybody? My name is Kevin, I go by Awakend, and today I'm going to be showing you guys how I made the drop in my remix of You Were Right by Illenium, Woolly, and Grabbits. I'm going to be breaking down in depth my entire layering process when it comes to leads, basses, super saws, drums, effects, all that good stuff. After the video, if you have any questions, just comment below and I'll do my best to get an answer to you. So to start off, for those of you who haven't heard this remix yet, I'm just going to play the drop so you can get an idea for what it is that I'm going to be breaking down. So let's take a look through all the different layers and stuff like that that I have going on. So generally the way that I like to split up my drop is into leads, and then I have my super saws and my mid basses together in one bus, and then I have my sub separated down at the bottom, and then I have like fills, glitches, basses, that kind of stuff all separated out. So the way that I like to group the synths in my drop is leads in one bus, and then chords and super saws and mid basses in another bus. And then I have my sub separately. Mainly this is for sidechaining, processing, automations and fills and stuff like that. So if we look into my lead bus, let me just play this for you guys on its own so you can hear what just my leads sound like. And then if I solo just my chords, my super saws, and my mid basses, let me show you guys what that sounds like. Now, just my saws and chords. And now just my mid basses. And then this is my sub on its own. And of course, drums and effects. So that's how those buses sound on their own. So let's dive into them individually and kind of see what's going on. So inside of my lead bus, this is where I would say kind of the majority of energy, spaciousness, tonality, this is where a lot of that comes from. So when you listen back to my whole lead bus, there's kind of a lot going on. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that you guys need to be having, 10 lead layers like I do, or however many this is, like 8 or 9. But when you want to layer a bunch of things together, this is how I like to go about it. I think about them all very intentionally. They all have their own very specific purpose. So let me just play each lead on its own for a second so you get a sense for how they sound. Right, so when you listen to each lead, they're all very distinct, right? They're all very different from one another. No one of those leads sounds the exact same as any of the other. They have different tonality, they have different texture, they have different timbre, they are playing in a different part of the stereo field. They're all very distinctly different, right? So if you're gonna layer a bunch of stuff together like this, you want to make sure that each lead or each layer, whether it's, whether you're doing this with leads or saws or whatever, you just want to make sure that each layer is actually distinct in some very significant way. ask yourself, is this next layer I'm adding different enough from what I already have, or is it just kind of similar to what I've already got? When you start layering a bunch of stuff like this on top of other layers, it gets messy really quickly, and you do need quite a bit of EQing and mixing to kind of fit them together so it's cohesive. And the more similar these layers are, the harder that job is going to be, right? So by default, because these layers are all so different from one another, they're so distinct from one another, they're going to fit together like a puzzle piece a lot more easily than if you tried to squeeze, 10 just standard sort of super saw lead layers together. So first and foremost, when you're looking at leads and making these big lead drops, make sure if you're going to add a bunch of lead layers, and again, I don't think you need to, this is just part of my style, but if you're going to, just make sure that each lead is very distinct and intentional, separate from the rest of the leads, so you don't just have a bunch of the same thing over and over again. So when you look at these leads, let me just break down kind of like what each one is doing here, right? So I would say there's kind of two main lead layers, and then there's a bunch of supporting layers. With leads, especially again, when you want to stack a bunch of them, you always want to kind of have that one hero layer, meaning you want to have one layer that really cuts through the mix. It's up front, it's in your face, it's very clear, and it's very tonal. It has a lot of that mid-range frequency, let's say from, 200 hertz up to maybe 1,000 or 2,000 hertz, give or take. And you want it to have a lot of clarity inside of that frequency range. So right now, I would say this is probably my main hero lead. And this is a strong second to support that. Right, so if you listen to the lead bus without those two, the lead bus still sounds nice. It still sounds pretty big, but it loses its presence, it loses its power, it loses its tonality, right? So all these other leads are basically just there to make these two leads sound really good. And pretty specifically, I would say this lead layer in particular is kind of the main lead overall. So you always want to have that one really clean, tonal, powerful main lead, the hero lead again. The reason that this one fits that job so well is because it's pretty mono, right? So it's kind of narrow. It's not super wide in the stereo field. It's kind of like in front of you, right? And then it's also very dry. I actually don't think this has any reverb on it at all. Let's look. It does, but it's off, right? So it shows reverb and delay, but these are actually not on. The mix is at 0, and this one's actually turned off the delay here. So it's completely dry, which means in the mix, it's going to be super present and close to you. So it's going to sound like the closest and the most clean overall. And then there's nothing really crazy going on in terms of processing, just a little bit of EQing to dip out some muddiness and some harshness in the high end. But this lead feels sharp and clean and upfront because it doesn't have any reverb on it. So that is in part what makes it the hero lead. You don't always have to have a perfectly dry hero lead, but less reverb is going to make that thing feel closer to you and more present and more tonal by default. So then this next lead, the one that's sort of like the secondary, so if we look at this, pretty simple. It's just a detuned square wave, basically. Hyperdimensions off. Yeah, so it's like, it's got some reverb, distortion, EQ, compression. It's actually pretty similar to the hero lead, but it's more distorted, and then there is some reverb on it. So it sort of places it behind, if this is the hero lead, it kind of places it behind that hero lead in the background. So it kind of gives it that extra depth. You can put reverb on the hero lead and achieve a similar effect. But again, this is why I like to add a bunch of layers, because it creates more complexity. It makes the lead feel bigger. If you have two leads with different textures, one of them's further away, versus just one lead with some reverb on it, when you have those two leads stacked appropriately, it's going to sound more interesting. It's going to sound more complex. Versus just the single lead with a little bit of reverb on it. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not going to be quite as complex. And again, that's why I like to layer a bunch of stuff together. So moving on to some of the other lead layers. What do we have going on here? So the main pattern, it's playing this do 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 do. Sorry for trying to sing that melody. I know that was horrible. it's playing this eighth note pattern, right? Where it's just playing two notes alternating up and down, and this is the melody, right? So these are the actual melody notes, and then these bottom notes are just basically coming from the chord harmonies and stuff like that. So that being the main melody means that I can have some of these supporting layers only playing that part of the melody, right? So like these layers, and then this top layer also. They're just playing those top notes. They're not playing, excuse me, they're not playing those bottom notes. Mainly in part just because these layers are super reverby. You know, they have a ton of reverb on them, so it just gets really messy when you have a sort of complicated pattern like this that moves around up and down a lot. When you have layers that have a lot of release and a long envelope and a lot of reverb, that pattern gets really messy really quickly. So this is a trick I learned. You can just have the top end, just the melody being played by, let's just call them supporting lead layers, right? So like this layer, one of the things about this layer is it's super wide, right? So I'm taking a utility here and I'm boosting the stereo width to 166%. I'm doing another one over here and I'm boosting it even further, another 130%. So if you listen to it with the main lead, you know, this one feels really wide. It's sort of like way out in the distance. And it's really just kind of supporting this main lead layer. You know, it creates width, it creates depth. This utility is doing nothing. And it just makes the main lead just feel bigger. Right, and you know, this EQ is kind of a mess. Don't worry too much about this. It's just cutting out some harshness in the high end, cutting out some low end and some high end. You know, cutting away lows and highs can also make something feel further away, especially taking away high frequencies. It can make it feel further away. So when you look at this layer, you know, this one, these two almost work in tandem. They're kind of similar. This one, this 73, it's more narrow. It has more high end. It has more texture. This 74, it's a lot wider. It's a little bit like maybe more distorted and not quite as thick in frequencies. So now if we play these two with the main lead. Again, they're all very different, right? I should notice if one of these gets turned off, it should be noticeable. If it's not, it's either too quiet or it's just way too similar to the other leads. So when you turn any one of these off, it's very noticeable and it's very different. It's very distinct from all the other lead layers, right? Like this one's actually really cool because it's actually a super simple lead when you look at it. This is actually just a noise table inside of a Serum preset that I found that I took and distorted the crap out of it. So this is what it sounds like by itself. Right, so like the saturators add a bunch of grit, they flatten it, and then adding another compressor flattens it even more, and then the reverb just gives it, you know, the reverb gives it a bunch of space. So it's really big and wide and kind of spacious. And again, because the main lead is really dry, these two, as well as a couple of the others, they're separated from it. They're different from it because they're very reverby, and so they're really far away in the mix. They're not really like on top of it, if that makes sense, right? If you have a bunch of dry stuff, it's all just going to be right in the same space. But if you have dry stuff, and then you have reverby stuff, and then you have wide reverby stuff, right? It separates them in an interesting way. This one's similar to those. It's reverby and it's far away, but it's sustained and it's kind of a lower octave, so it has a different characteristic. So then on top of that, I do have another lead layer that kind of supports this main pattern and plays the same pattern. This one's really simple, but I actually use this all the time. It basically creates this really sharp sort of transient sound so that the lead kind of cuts through more. You know, I like these really driven staccato sort of leads. And so this sound does a great job of just adding this really sharp kind of biting, like transient high end to this main lead so it sticks out more. All right, so now if we add those two to these three. So if you've ever wondered how to get your lead, you know, really like sharp, if you have like ARPs and stuff like that and you really want it to cut through the mix, that is a great way to go about it. This was a preset from a Cashmere pack that I changed a bunch, but the main thing that's giving it that bite is this envelope 3 is set to the master tune. So it's basically a pitch envelope. So if you look down here at the decay value, this is a super short decay, right? And it's taking the master tune, it's taking the pitch, and it's creating this really sharp envelope. Right, so if you lengthen it a bunch, it turns into basically like a laser, if you ever want to make a laser sound. But when it's really short like that, it just creates this really sharp kind of transient sound. And then the distortion and filter kind of help a little bit, make it a little bit sharper. So very simple sound. So next up, we have the final couple of layers. So these two also kind of work in tandem. So we have this layer. There's a couple interesting things about this layer. These two layers together, actually. They're both playing harmonies. So when it plays this top melody, it's also playing a harmony below that. And so that harmonic layer, the harmony beneath the lead, really adds a lot of depth, actually. I really do this a lot, and I think it's a really cool technique to do. So now if you listen to this with the main lead. You know, it just makes that lead feel really thick and fat, and it adds some more emotion to it when you have those harmonies. But the other thing that's cool about this layer is that it's actually playing the bass as well. It's playing the bass note that the same, like the mid basses are playing, right? And so when you look at this in its construction, it's actually very simple. You know, again, it's just something I made. It's a detuned supersaw with another detuned supersaw that's a little bit extra on the detuning, and then it has delay, and then it's being fed into a reverb, which kind of causes this crazy distortion. The delay creates extra feedback, and so when you take the lead and you feed it into the distortion, but you add the extra load of the delay, it creates even more grit and distortion. You know, the more signal that goes into a distortion unit, the more distorted it's going to become, right? So if you feed a delay into the distortion unit, that's going to really compress it pretty heavily and then, you know, distort it a lot more aggressively. This one is also, you know, dry in the sense that it doesn't have any reverb. And so then this is sort of its counterpart. And as you can see, it has a decent amount of reverb on it, and then it also has kind of a long release tail, right? So it kind of like floats in the mix a little bit. It's a little bit more spacious, whereas like the main lead is kind of punchy and tight. And again, this lead is not playing those bottom notes because it would just get too chaotic playing back and forth because it has a long envelope and a long reverb. So as you can see, you know, in these leads, I would say like three of them, maybe four of them, are either dry or have a little bit of reverb, and then the other half are pretty heavily reverbed. And in my drop, that's the only thing that has reverb on it. My supersaws have zero reverb, my basses have zero reverb. There's nothing else in this drop that has reverb on it, not even my drums or anything like that. So the only reverb in my drop is on these 4 layers. There's like a little bit on this one, but like barely. Right, so because of that, everything else in the drop is very focused and kind of close to center. It's clean in the sense that it doesn't have a bunch of reverb on it, because reverb creates extra harmonics you might not want. It creates extra noise you might not want. And so because these are the only layers with reverb, and then they're all sort of in a different part of the stereo field, right? Like if you think about the stereo field kind of wrapping around you, you have close right in front of your face, you have far away right in front of your face, and then you have, you know, wide stuff that's close to you, stuff that's really wide. This reverb kind of creates this bit of variety, so you get this cool bit of depth. You know, it becomes a lot more deep of a mix when you listen to all these layers together. Let me play it without the reverb layers to show you. It's also where a lot of that kind of screaminess comes from. If you've ever listened to one of my drops, or maybe like a Nurko drop, or whoever, Last Heroes, you know, that screaminess on drops can come from those kind of far away reverby layers. So that is the lead bus. There's nothing crazy going on as far as group processing. Just some EQs, just cutting some resonant frequencies. You know, there's some automations and stuff that I mostly go over in my previous YouTube video where I'm talking about drop fills. And then that's really it. You know, it's a sidechain compressor. There's no crazy OTTs or compressors or anything like that. So group processing does not need to be crazy. In my newer songs, I have updated a little bit to use a little more multi-band compression and stuff like that. But my point in showing you that is you don't need to go crazy. I see a lot of producers using like 3 OTTs and all these compressors, and they don't even understand the settings. And then their leads or their drop in general just sounds really squashed or muddy or dark or something terrible like that. And they're not really sure how to fix it. And oftentimes just turning off the OTTs, turning off the compressors actually fixes the problem. So I'm not saying don't compress or don't use OTTs, but only do so if you actually know what it's doing. Because if you don't know what it's doing, it's going to make your stuff sound worse. So in general, my preference and my advice, especially when you're kind of newer, maybe intermediate, you're not super familiar with those plugins and your ears aren't super well attenuated, avoid excess compression, avoid excess multi-band compression, OTT, that kind of stuff. So moving on to the saws and the mid basses. So with the saws, I tend to only do 2 or 3 layers at the absolute maximum. Even 2 is enough. But let me just show you what they're each doing individually. Let me just pull up my Serum for each of these. So the way that I think about saws is you want one really narrow layer, and with those narrow layers, generally I'm going to make them a little bit more gritty, you know, so they have high end and texture. Usually I achieve that with just like a saturator or some type of distortion. So one really mono layer, does not need very much stereo width, just a little bit, but not a lot. You don't need it to be perfectly mono, but you want it to be mostly mono with maybe a little bit of stereo width. From there, you want one super wide layer that's just way, way, way out in the stereo field. And then a third layer is optional, which is adding some type of texture or unique characteristic. So right, if we listen to this gritty saw on the bottom, if you look at the actual Serum patch, right, it's literally just a single saw wave in the sub, which is where most of the sound is coming from. And then there's this like slightly detuned kind of subtle saw wave. And then there's another one here that's an octave down, which sounds similar to the sub, but it's just wide. So it's not heavily detuned, it's like slightly detuned, but then it's wide. You know, again, saturators add grit. And then just EQing. Again, don't worry about all these EQs. People will see this and get really overwhelmed. You don't need to do this. This is just how I used to do it back when I was really anal about doing like all these tiny little EQs. But these days I use far fewer EQs, maybe just one, to just make a couple of cuts. You don't need to have 9 EQ8s or whatever I have. So don't worry about that. So this saw is really narrow. This is the big main wide saw that I have. You know, just your typical very wide detuned super saws. The white noise in the sub are honestly not even doing anything. Hyperdimension makes it a little bit more intense and more wide, boosting the highs, cutting the lows, a little bit of distortion, nothing crazy. And then from there, I'm actually making the width very intensely over exaggeratedly wide. I don't know if that's even a word, but basically I'm taking the stereo width and just completely pushing it beyond its limit. I'm also cutting high end off here. I'm cutting white noise off because I have a white noise layer down here that sounds like this. So I tend to high cut my saws as well, as you can see on this gritty saw down here, on this wide saw here. I'm going to cut it somewhere between, you know, 10K and 12K, somewhere in that range. It's easy to overdo, so don't cut too much off, but enough to make space for the white noise, which is generally going to be like 10K and above, something like that. So yeah, this layer, it's very wide, detuned saws. I'm pushing the stereo width to 217%. I wouldn't recommend going very far beyond 200% if you're going to do this. But this layer is already has a lot of voices because it has 16 unison voices. They're very detuned, so there's already a lot of harmonic notes that could be spread apart. So then if you take a stereo widening tool like Ozone or like a utility and push it, it's really easy to do so. Whereas like with a mono saw like this, it's not so easy to make wide because it's very narrow to begin with. The voicings and the unison count are already pretty center, so it's a lot harder to kind of spread those apart. So with the big detuned saw, that's the one that I generally choose to make really wide. Something else I'm doing is taking a mid-side EQ and I'm cutting off more of the low-end tonality and high-end stuff from the mono because that makes more space for this mono saw down here, right? This mono saw, I'm also doing the inverse. I'm taking away more low end from the sides to make more room for these wide saws. So then the third layer, this layer is the sort of optional, let's just call it more unique layer. And what this is doing a little bit differently is it's adding this phaser effect. And so it sounds different from the other two, right? And as always, my test is how noticeable is it when you turn one of them off? You always want it to be pretty noticeable. So up above here, I have a few lead layers, and these are all just playing the, basically the top melody that these chords are playing. You know, so this melody here that the chord is playing, it's just being played by these leads. So nothing super crazy, it just adds a little bit more depth and power and tonality to the super saw stack layers. So again, the saws all together with the white noise. And then again, on my saws, zero reverb. I very much recommend not putting reverb on your super saws. I promise it will save you a gigantic headache. Lots of producers that I talk to and work with have reverb on almost every super saw in their stack. A lot of super saw presets come with reverb on them because when you hit play, it sounds really big. But if you're trying to put together a big drop stack like this and you want it to sound professional, there's not really room for that reverb in the mix because you're already going to have like reverby leads and maybe some vocals and some other stuff like that. So those saws are just much better off in the mix just being totally dry. I promise it'll save you a ton of headache in terms of EQing and mixing. So very strongly recommend keep those super saws nice and dry. So let's look at these mid basses next. So there's a couple things going on here. I have plucked eighth note mid basses. And then I have sustained long mid bass notes. So it's a similar concept to how I do my leads. You know, you want with mid basses, you want to have like one kind of strong center, you know, kind of mono mid bass, and then you want to have one kind of big wide mid bass. And then beyond that, you can just have as many supporting mid basses as you really want. You just have to cut most of the low end frequencies away from those supporting mid basses, right? So like if you listen to these mono mid basses that are being plucked, these eighth note staccato notes, this is the main bass here. You know, it has a pretty decent amount of low end. And then these top two are just adding kind of texture and bite and energy. But do you notice how you don't really hear like bass frequencies without this bottom one, right? So that's where the majority of the warmth comes from. The mid bass frequency range that is probably the most important is going to be between like 70 and let's say 120 hertz, roughly. Sometimes 80 to 140, but 70 to 120, roughly speaking. So a lot of people with mid basses, what I see them doing is they'll just cut it like all the way up to like 150 because they want to make more space for their sub. But the problem with that is there's a lot of really important low end frequencies in that range. And it's a very particular range. So even if you cut it at 100 hertz, you might be cutting off super important frequencies. So with mid basses, again, if you have, let's say 3, at least one of them needs to have some frequencies all the way down to about 80 hertz, roughly speaking, in my opinion, if you have, right, the big melodic bass drop. I mean, there's future bass drops and stuff like that that just don't have mid basses. Maybe they just have like a big 808, like a San Holo drop. So you don't really need mid basses in that case. But for this style of drop, you want to have those big mid basses because they actually really help the super saws sound more powerful. And so you got to have just that one, at least one layer that has frequencies all the way down to about 70 hertz. You want to be careful not to cut off too much higher than that. Right, so again, each one of these is doing its own job, but this is the main one that provides the majority of the tonality and presence, and it's basically mono, right? These other 2 layers are just adding high end. And as you can see, I'm cutting off all the low end, right? I'm doing a very aggressive low cut on these mid basses. This one, not quite as much, but still all the bass has been cut away. When it's 250, there's no bass left at that point. So at the sustained basses, we've got a textural 3rd layer. We've got the kind of main wide layer. And then we've got the sort of main mono layer. So the mono layer has a lot of the low end and high end cut off from the sides. The wide layer has all of the low end and high end cut out from the mono. So this is the side, this is the mono. And as you can see, pretty much everything's cut away from the mono. So that makes more space for the actual mono layer. Right, so this is the main wide layer, and then this is the main mono layer. And then this layer is just kind of adding some extra kind of texture and stuff like that. You can see I'm very aggressively low cutting this one. Yeah, this top layer is the most subtle. This one's not doing a ton, but overall it's adding a little bit of extra depth. So altogether, so this is where these 3 layers is where all the low end's coming from. These 3 layers is where all the texture and extra high end is coming from. So certain layers can be kind of clean and tonal in the low end. Certain layers can just be super gritty and super crazy sounding in the high end without having really any low end to speak of. That way you can go really crazy with distorting, but then not lose the tonality, right? If you add all this saturation and overdrive and all these different, erosions and more saturators, like you just lose all the tonality of the bass. Whereas this one is basically not, I don't even know if it has distortion on it at all. Maybe a little bit of tube saturation or something inside of Anna, but yeah, there's not even distortion or anything on it. So it's just a really clean, like sort of saw wave sound. There's barely any processing on it. And again, it's very mono because I took out all the low end using a mid-side EQ. I took out all the low end from the sides. So similar layering concept when it comes to saws, leads, mid basses, you want to have those kind of mono-ish sort of hero layers driving most of it, and then you can have kind of as many supporting layers as you want from there. So this is my sub, which I converted to audio. And I used to do this. I don't necessarily recommend it because it's tedious, but it does work really well. If you want to get your kick-sub relationship really dialed in, you can do this, and where you convert your sub to audio. And this allows you to, literally create a manual audio fade at the exact right moment for your kick overlapping so that they don't fight each other. But yeah, this is the sub. You can see the EQ8 here, just showing you the frequency composition. So it's got a lot of harmonics, right? It's not just a sine wave. I think that this was the sub that I actually used. Let's see, this is really quiet. Oops. It was more. Yeah, kind of like that. And it is actually just, you know, basically a sine wave with an Ableton saturator on it. So nothing super crazy, but I converted it to audio and then faded it in perfectly so that there was lots of space for the kick. So that's all the synths. Together, if you play all the synths, mid basses, saws, leads, sub, sounds like this. So then we'll take a look at the drums, kind of the final thing, right? So in this drop, we've got one kick, which is spliced together. I could probably tell you from at least 2 or 3 different kicks, maybe a video for another, a topic for another video. But I like to Frankenstein kicks together. So you have a different transient and a different body and then a different tail. It's not how I always do it. You're much better off just finding one kick sample, trust me, but sometimes you have to Frankenstein kicks together to make them sound good. With kicks on drops like this, I like to layer them with some sort of splashy high-end percussive stuff. So this kick has a crash underneath it. And then has another crash here. This one's almost more of a ride. But there's a couple of important things about these samples. So this is the actual sample. It's a very long crash. But when you have long crashes like that, like let's just say every kick had this super long crash on it, then you end up with all this extra stuff in your drop, all this extra high end just kind of floating around in the background, which you don't necessarily want. If you want a punchy melodic bass or melodic dubstep song, then your drums need to be pretty short and pretty precise and pretty punchy, right? So like when you listen to this kick with this crash, they almost sound like they're meant to fit together. It fades out at just the right time, you know, like this would probably be too short. But again, like this is too long. So just nice and short. And this is all about just manually fading it in. There's no perfect rhyme or reason or trick to this. Just fade it in, give it a little audio fade. In any DAW you can do this until it sounds right. This other one, again, they're distinct in that this one's a lot brighter. So 1 is fine. Sometimes I'll do 2 or 3. You don't need to overdo this. Nothing super crazy. It's not super complex, but layer some splashy percussion on top of your kick and it'll go a really long way. So then with the snare, again, I'm fairly confident this is at least 2 or 3 snares kind of spliced together. But the point is, this is the main snare. It's very punchy. It has a sharp transient. It has a nice tone on the body. Has this nice low end. And then I layer it with some other stuff. This is a Cashmere snare enhancer. It's from Cashmere Volume 3, which is an awesome pack if you don't have it. And it's kind of similar to this up above, right? It's just adding some kind of like splashy high end. Same thing here. So it's just adding more depth, making the drums more interesting. Right, without all that stuff, it's a lot more plain. So it's just a great way to make those drums feel a lot more energetic. Down below, what else do we have? We have some rides in between the kicks and the snares. I should mention too, for the snare, I actually have this little reverse every so often. I think this is literally just the snare, the main snare just reversed. Yeah, so it's like... So just every other. And then from there we've got some rides. Nothing super crazy here going on, but there's a couple things to mention. I did actually tune it down so that it kind of fits the actual vibe of the song. I often am just doing this by ear. You can sometimes use like a spectrum or something like that to try and figure out what the main resonant frequency of, let's say, a snare or a ride or whatever is. You know, so maybe like one of these. And then kind of like find that note on a spectrum. Again, it's very much by ear, guys. There's not a perfect system here, but the point is I am paying attention to the pitch of the rides and the hats and stuff like that. Not always, but they do feel a little off sometimes if you don't pay attention to that kind of stuff. I also have an auto pan here, which is shortening the ride. You know, again, keeping in the theme of keeping those drums kind of tight and punchy. You don't want this infinite ride tail where there's just tons of high end in the background, because it makes the drop overall lose a lot of punch. It is a little bit messier. And then from there, I've also got a loop from a cymatics pack with a bunch of processing on it. Let's just turn the sidechain and the utility on. Right, so again, it's been tuned a little bit more appropriately to the song. Erosion adds like grit. Chorus gives it a little bit of characteristic and stereo width, and then just cutting away like excess low end and some sharpness in the high end. So then that, with everything, and yeah, you can see in this loop, I'm fading it in because this loop actually had kicks and snares in there, and I didn't want that. I wanted my own kick and snare, so I faded in every time there's a kick and a snare. And there's also a sidechain compressor, so it's ducking this loop ever so slightly whenever there is a kick or a snare, so it kind of gets it out of the way of the transient of the kick and the snare. And you know, the ride and the loop here, they play a huge role in driving this drop forwards. They really add a lot of energy. You know, the drums just really get boring without them. So they really add a lot. They go a long way in making the drop more energetic. And then you'll also notice that there are pauses here. This is whenever I have a fill. So whenever I have these big glitchy kind of bass fills, I'm going to pause the percussion basically. So there's like nothing really there. I mean, there's a tiny bit of snare tail and stuff like that, but for the most part, I'm cutting out the audio of the loops and whatnot whenever that sort of stuff happens. So that's the drums. And if you guys want to see these fills and stuff, how I made these, this is in the previous tutorial that I posted on YouTube about how to make melodic bass drop fills. So please go check that out as well. The final little detail here is effects. So when the drop starts, like right at the advent, right at the beginning of the drop, there's some crashes and stuff like that. So it's kind of amazing how big of a difference that can make at the beginning of a drop. They're not super loud, but they do make a difference, as you heard. So this is just an unprocessed crash sample, and then this is a crash sample. Yeah, there's not even reverb on it. Just two different crashes. This one has some stereo width on it. This one also has some stereo width on it. A little bit of EQing to cut away some harshness. But that's basically it. Nothing super complicated. So that's all I have in the effects. In terms of the drop, it's just some crashes at the beginning of the drop, and then when the drop kind of turns around and resets, there's some crashes right in the middle with a little sweep. With a little sub drop, not a sweep. And yeah, guys, that's the whole drop. So I hope this helps to sort of demystify some layering techniques and stuff like that. You know, there's a lot going on, but when you look at it, kind of breaking down layer by layer, it's actually not super complicated. When you're layering leads, saws, basses, anything like that, right? You just want to be very intentional. Again, try to use as little reverb as possible. Try to have some layers pretty narrow, kind of feel like they're right in front of you, you know, lots of tonality, meaning don't EQ it too much, don't distort it too much, don't process it too much. And when you do have at least one lead, saw, and bass that fit that category, clean, tonal, somewhat narrow, not heavily distorted. Then from there, you can kind of go crazy with layering as long as you're cutting away the tonality, the low end of those other layers. You know, add the craziest distortion and processing you've ever thought about doing, but EQ a lot of it away so that main hero lead can really cut through the mix and have a lot of presence. That's what gives drops power, that tonal presence in the mid-range, again, like 200 to 1,000. That stuff really drives a drop. It really makes it sound clean across all of the sound systems you might be listening to it on. So cannot recommend that layering technique enough. And again, guys, if you do have questions, just comment below. I do my best to interact and answer those questions you might have. And as a side note, I also do offer mentorship for anybody interested. Please feel free to check out the description below for some links for some more information. You can DM me or comment below if you are interested. I'd be happy to chat and see if it's a good fit. So thank you guys for watching this tutorial. Again, please let me know if you have any questions. Just comment below and I'll do my best to respond. And until next time, peace.